The year was 1873, when Mark Twain gave a name to an entire era of American history. He called it the Gilded Age, a phrase that captured both the glittering surface and the darker realities beneath. The word gilded means covered with a thin layer of gold, suggesting something beautiful on the outside but hiding a different truth within. This was America in the late 19th century, a nation transforming from a collection of farms and small towns into an industrial powerhouse, and at the center of this transformation stood a handful of families whose names would become synonymous with wealth, power, and influence. These families did not simply accumulate money. They shaped the very architecture of American capitalism, built the railroads that connected the coasts, drilled the oil that powered the nation, forged the steel that constructed cities, and controlled the banks that financed it all. Their wealth was so immense that it defies modern comparison. When adjusted for today's economy, some of these men possessed fortunes that would dwarf the wealth of contemporary billionaires. They were America's first plutocracy, a ruling class not of kings and queens but of industrialists and financiers who wielded power that rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of the government itself. The story begins not in a mansion or a boardroom, but in the cramped quarters of immigrant ships and the dusty streets of young America. John Jacob Astor arrived in New York in 1783 with almost nothing to his name. Born in the small German town of Waldorf, he was the son of a butcher who spent more time in the beer house than at his work. Young Johann Jakob, as he was known then, had no education beyond basic literacy and no connections beyond his own ambition. What he did have was an extraordinary ability to see opportunity where others saw only wilderness. Astor started in the fur trade, a business that required both ruthless efficiency and an understanding of complex supply chains, stretching from the frontier to European markets. He would purchase furs from trappers and Native American traders, often using tactics that his competitors found questionable. His methods were effective. By 1800, just 17 years after arriving in America, Astor was worth $250,000, an enormous sum equivalent to over $6 million today. But fur was only the beginning. Astor understood something that would become the foundation of his dynasty and set a pattern for generations of wealthy Americans to follow. Land in Manhattan was going to become extraordinarily valuable. While others built businesses that could rise and fall with market conditions, Astor bought dirt. He purchased vacant lots and undeveloped properties throughout lower Manhattan, often in areas that seemed worthless at the time. He bought 70 acres of what would become Midtown Manhattan, stretching from 42nd to 46th Street between Broadway and the Hudson River. People thought he was mad. The land was far from the developed areas of the city, swampy in places, seemingly useless, but Astor waited. He leased the land rather than selling it, ensuring that his family would benefit not just from one transaction, but from generations of rental income. As New York exploded in population and economic importance, those worthless lots became some of the most valuable real estate on earth. By the time John Jacob Astor died in 1848, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, and his fortune was built on a foundation that would last. He understood that in America, real estate was destiny. His descendants took this lesson to heart. William Backhouse Astor, John Jacob's son, inherited the majority of the estate and continued the program of Manhattan real estate investment. He built over 700 stores and residences throughout the city. The Astors became known as the landlords of New York. By 1890, experts calculated that the family owned 1/20 of all real estate in New York City. Their holdings included what would become Times Square, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and countless other properties that bore their name. But the Astors were not content to simply own property. They shaped society itself. Caroline Astor, wife of William Backhouse Astor Jr., became the undisputed queen of New York's social elite during the Gilded Age. Known simply as Mrs. Astor, she wielded her influence with precision and purpose. She understood that, in America, where there were no hereditary titles or nobility, social status had to be created and maintained through other means. She drew a clear line between old money and new money, between those families whose wealth stretched back generations and the newly rich industrialists who had made their fortunes in railroads, oil and steel. Together with social arbiter Ward McAllister, Mrs. Astor created the 400, a list of New York's most fashionable and acceptable people. The number was supposedly based on the capacity of her ballroom, though it served a more important function. It established who was in and who was out. The 400 represented old money, families of Western European descent who had been wealthy for at least 3 generations. They upheld tradition and manners, hosted elaborate balls that lasted until dawn, and looked down upon anyone who worked with their hands or whose fortune was too recently acquired. His social gatekeeping was about to face its greatest challenge. Because while the Astors represented the old guard, a new breed of American was emerging from the crucible of industrialization. These men had not inherited wealth. They had clawed their way up from nothing, built empires through force of will and often questionable methods. And they were about to knock on the doors of high society with fortunes that made even the Astors take notice. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a poor farmer who operated a small ferry boat. He had almost no formal education, pulled out of school at age 11 to work on his father's boat. But young Cornelius possessed something more valuable than education. He had an instinct for business and an aggressive, relentless drive that would earn him the nickname the Commodore. By age 16, he had saved $100 and bought his own boat, ferrying cargo and passengers around New York Harbor. He saw how the water connected commerce, how control of transportation meant control of trade. Vanderbilt moved into steamships when the technology was still new and risky. He worked for others, learned the business, then went into competition with his former employers. His tactics were brutal. He would slash prices below cost, driving competitors into bankruptcy, then raise them once he controlled the route. He fought fair wars, engaged in cutthroat competition, and never backed down from a fight. By the time the Civil War ended, Vanderbilt had amassed a fortune estimated at $40 million from his shipping empire. Then he made a decision that would multiply his wealth many times over. He sold his steamship interests and pivoted entirely to railroads. The Commodore understood that rail was the future of American transportation. The nation was expanding westward, and whoever controlled the railroads would control the movement of goods, people, and ultimately, wealth. He bought up competing railroad lines, consolidated them into coherent systems, and built the New York Central Railroad into one of the most powerful corporations in America. Vanderbilt's methods were often questionable. He manipulated stock prices, bribed legislators, and crushed anyone who stood in his way. He was called a robber baron, a term that originated in medieval Europe to describe nobles who charged illegal tolls. But Vanderbilt did not care about his reputation among the social elite. He cared about building and controlling. When he died in 1877, he left an estate valued at over $100 million, making him the wealthiest American who had ever lived up to that point. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited most of the fortune and proved even more adept at growing it. William doubled the family wealth in less than a decade, making the Vanderbilt name synonymous with extravagant riches. But here, the Vanderbilts faced a problem. They had money, enormous amounts of it, but they did not have acceptance from New York's old money elite. Mrs. Astor and the 400 looked down on them as new money, as people who had earned their wealth through trade rather than inherited it, through generations of breeding and refinement. This rejection particularly galled Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore. Alva was a woman of fierce ambition and social cunning. She understood that money alone would not buy entry into the highest levels of society, but it could be used as a weapon. She built a mansion on Fifth Avenue designed to outshine anything the old money families possessed. She threw parties of such opulence that they became the talk of the city. When the Vanderbilts were denied a box at the Academy of Music, the preferred opera house of the old guard, Alva helped fund a competing institution that would become the Metropolitan Opera. The final blow came in March 1883, when Alva threw what became known as the Great Fancy Dress Ball. She spent over $250,000 on the event, an astronomical sum equivalent to millions today. The guest list was carefully curated. Everyone who was anyone in New York society received an invitation, with one notable exception. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Caroline, was not invited. This created a social crisis. Young Caroline desperately wanted to attend what promised to be the event of the decade, but etiquette dictated that her mother would have to call on Alva Vanderbilt first. Acknowledging the Vanderbilt family's social standing, Mrs. Astor had a choice. She could maintain her principles and refuse to acknowledge these upstart millionaires, or she could bend. After days of internal struggle, she made the journey to the Vanderbilt mansion and left her calling card. The message was clear. The Vanderbilts had arrived. The gates of high society had opened, if only a crack, and new money had forced its way in through sheer overwhelming force. But even as the Vanderbilts celebrated their social victory, another figure was quietly building an empire that would dwarf even theirs. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in rural New York, the son of a conman father who sold fake medicines and disappeared for months at a time, and a devoutly religious Baptist mother who taught her children the virtues of charity and frugality. This combination of influences would shape Rockefeller's entire approach to business and life. At age 12, Rockefeller loaned $50 of his savings to a neighbor. When the neighbor repaid him with interest the following year, young John experienced an epiphany. Money could work for you. Your capital could generate more capital without any physical labor on your part. This insight, combined with his mother's lessons about careful management and long-term thinking, became the foundation of his business philosophy. Rockefeller entered the oil business in 1863, just as the industry was beginning to boom. Oil had been discovered in Pennsylvania, and the race was on to drill, refine, and sell this black liquid that could be turned into kerosene for lamps and fuel for industry. The oil business was chaotic, with hundreds of small operators competing, prices wildly fluctuating, and fortunes made and lost overnight. Rockefeller looked at this chaos and saw inefficiency. He believed that competition was wasteful and destructive, that the industry needed to be organized and controlled. He founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870 and set about consolidating the oil industry. His methods were systematic and ruthless. Rockefeller would approach competing refineries and make them an offer, sell to him at a reasonable price, or he would drive them out of business. He had the capital to undercut any competitor, selling oil below cost until the rival went bankrupt, then purchasing their assets for pennies on the dollar. He negotiated secret deals with railroads, getting rates so low that competitors could not match them. He created what would later be called a horizontal monopoly, buying up refineries until he controlled the vast majority of oil refining in America. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of oil refineries and pipelines in the United States. Rockefeller had achieved something unprecedented in American business. He had taken a chaotic, competitive industry and brought it under the control of a single entity. The efficiencies he created were real. Standard Oil could refine and distribute petroleum more cheaply than dozens of competing firms. But the power he wielded was also unprecedented and troubling. Subscribe to our channel to explore more fascinating stories of power, wealth, and the forces that shaped modern America. Rockefeller's wealth grew to staggering proportions. When he died in 1937, his net worth was estimated at $1.4 billion. Some financial historians argue his inflation-adjusted wealth may have reached $400 billion, making him potentially the richest person who ever lived. But Rockefeller was different from other robber barons in one crucial respect. He took his mother's lessons about charity and stewardship seriously. Over his lifetime, he donated over $530 million to various causes, creating universities, funding medical research, and establishing foundations that continue their work today. The Rockefeller family also did something that the Vanderbilts failed to do. They planned for generational wealth. John D. Rockefeller did not simply leave his children money. He taught them the principles of long-term financial planning, privacy, understated elegance, and philanthropy. The family established trusts and a formal family office to manage their wealth across generations. They avoided the ostentatious displays that characterized other wealthy families, choosing instead a more discreet approach that would preserve their fortune and influence for over a century. But of all the figures who dominated the Gilded Age, perhaps none wielded more direct power over the American economy than John Pierpont Morgan. Born in 1837 into a wealthy family, Morgan represented a different type of power. He was not an industrialist who built things or extracted resources. He was a financier who controlled capital itself. Through his bank, he could determine which businesses would flourish and which would fail, which industries would consolidate, and which would remain fragmented. Morgan was groomed from birth to enter the family banking business. His grandfather had co-founded the insurance company Aetna. His father was a successful international banker. Young Pierpont, as he was known, received the finest education money could buy. He attended boarding school in Switzerland, studied at the University of Göttingen in Germany, became fluent in French and German, and developed advanced mathematical skills. One of his professors suggested he pursue an academic career, but his father had other plans. He wanted to create an American banking dynasty, and his son would be the cornerstone. Morgan returned to New York and began working at Duncan Sherman and Company, the American agent for his father's London banking house. He showed his talent early. In 1859, while in New Orleans on business, he gambled the firm's capital on a shipment of coffee that he believed was undervalued. He sold it for a substantial profit, demonstrating both his business instinct and his willingness to take calculated risks. In 1861, with his father's support, he founded what would eventually become J. Pierpont Morgan and Company. Morgan's philosophy of business was fundamentally different from the competitive capitalism that most people assume defined the American economy. He did not believe in competition. He thought it was wasteful and led to boom and bust cycles that destabilized the entire economy. Instead, Morgan believed in consolidation and control. He would use his bank's resources to buy up competing companies in a given industry, merge them into massive corporations, and install his own men on the boards of directors to ensure they operated in concert rather than competition. Over his career, Morgan organized or financed 42 major corporations, including United States Steel, General Electric, International Harvester, and 21 different railroads. He held controlling interests in Aetna, Western Union, the Pullman Car Company, and dozens of other businesses. Through these interlocking directorates, Morgan exercised influence over virtually every major sector of the American economy. He was not exaggerating when he said that he preferred to do business based on character rather than contracts. If he trusted you, you could get virtually unlimited financing. If he did not trust you, no amount of collateral would help. Morgan also played a role that no institution officially held in the United States during his era. The country had no central bank, no Federal Reserve to stabilize financial markets during times of crisis. So Morgan became, in effect, the lender of last resort. In 1895, when the federal government's gold reserves were being depleted, and the nation faced the possibility of abandoning the gold standard, Morgan organized a syndicate of banks that loaned the government more than $60 million in gold, saving the nation's credit. The most dramatic example came in 1907 during the financial panic of that year. Multiple trust companies and banks were failing, creating a cascade effect that threatened to bring down the entire financial system. Morgan, then 70 years old, held a series of meetings at his library and his home. He gathered the most powerful bankers in the country and, through a combination of persuasion and intimidation, convinced them to pool their resources and bail out the failing institutions. He personally decided which firms would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. He stayed up through multiple nights, orchestrating the rescue of the American economy. Initially, Morgan was praised as a hero who had saved the nation from financial catastrophe. But praise turned to suspicion. People began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did one man have so much power? What gave him the right to decide the fate of the American economy? The progressive movement was gaining strength, and politicians and journalists increasingly questioned the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of so few men. In 1912, Morgan was called to testify before the Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation into whether a money trust controlled American finance. The hearings were designed to determine if a small group of bankers, with Morgan at the center, had created a financial oligarchy that controlled American industry through interlocking directorates and consolidated capital. The committee's findings were damning. They calculated that the partners of J.P. Morgan and Company, along with directors of First National and National City Bank, controlled aggregate resources of over $22 billion. To put this in perspective, this was comparable to the value of all property in the 22 states west of the Mississippi River. Morgan defended himself and his methods. He argued that control of credit and industry should be based on character and trust, not on formal regulations. He believed that he and his fellow bankers had the wisdom and the responsibility to manage the nation's economy better than politicians or bureaucratic institutions could. But the American public was increasingly skeptical of this argument. They saw not wise stewards, but a cabal of unelected oligarchs who answered to no one but themselves. The Pujo hearings led directly to major reforms. In 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating a central banking system that would, in theory, prevent any single private banker from wielding the power that Morgan had held. The Clayton Antitrust Act followed in 1914, further constraining the ability of businesses to consolidate control through interlocking directorates. Morgan died in 1913, just months after his testimony, and with him died an era of unchecked financial power. But the families endured. The Rockefeller family diversified their holdings and became major philanthropists, their foundation supporting medical research, education, and later environmental causes. Ironically, over a century after John D. Rockefeller built his fortune on oil, his descendants would become advocates for divesting from fossil fuels, arguing that oil had no place in their future. The family wealth, though spread among hundreds of descendants, remains substantial, with collective holdings estimated at over $10 billion. The Morgan Bank evolved and merged, eventually becoming J.P. Morgan Chase, currently the most valuable bank in the world. The Astor family's real estate holdings eventually dwindled as descendants sold off properties, though their name remains emblazoned on buildings and streets throughout New York City. John Jacob Astor IV, great-grandson of the family patriarch, died aboard the Titanic in 1912, one of the wealthiest passengers on that doomed ship. The Vanderbilt fortune dissipated more quickly than others, a cautionary tale about the importance of estate planning and the difficulty of maintaining wealth across generations. Without the trusts and family constitutions that protected the Rockefeller wealth, the Vanderbilt fortune was divided and subdivided, spent on lavish lifestyles and poor investments, until by the mid-20th century, there was relatively little left. Anderson Cooper, descendant of the Vanderbilt line through his mother Gloria Vanderbilt, inherited only $1.5 million, a substantial sum for most families, but a tiny fraction of what his ancestors had possessed. These families did not simply accumulate wealth. They fundamentally reshaped American society, economy, and culture. They built the railroads that unified the continent, the banks that financed industrial expansion, the corporations that mass-produced goods, and the institutions that defined high culture. They also created profound inequality, destroyed countless smaller businesses, exploited workers, and concentrated power to a degree that many found incompatible with democracy. The Gilded Age was a period of incredible transformation, and these families were both the agents and the beneficiaries of that transformation. They lived in a time when there were few regulations on business, no income tax, no antitrust laws worth the name, and no political will to constrain the accumulation of private wealth. They took advantage of these conditions with remarkable efficiency. Their legacy is complex and contradictory. The institutions they founded, from universities to libraries to museums, continue to benefit millions of people. The corporations they built, though much changed, remain pillars of the American economy, but they also demonstrated the dangers of unchecked capitalism, the ways in which concentrated wealth can distort both markets and democracy. The story of these families is ultimately a story about America itself, about a nation that promises opportunity to anyone willing to work for it, but also creates conditions that allow some to amass godlike power. It is about the tension between democracy and plutocracy, between the ideal of equal opportunity and the reality of inherited privilege. These families ruled not through formal political power, but through control of capital, and their influence shaped the nation in ways we still feel today. The Gilded Age eventually gave way to the Progressive Era, as reformers pushed back against the concentration of wealth and power. Antitrust laws were strengthened. Labor unions gained legal protection, the income tax was instituted, and the Federal Reserve was created to prevent any single banker from holding the kind of power Morgan had wielded. But the basic dynamics that created the Gilded Age remained. Innovation creates opportunity. Opportunity creates wealth, and wealth, if unconstrained, concentrates into dynasties that can shape society according to their interests and values. Today, we live in what some call a new Gilded Age, with levels of inequality approaching those of the late 19th century. Tech billionaires build empires in software rather than oil or steel. Private equity, rather than investment banks, consolidates industries. But the fundamental questions remain the same. How much wealth should any individual or family be allowed to accumulate? What responsibilities come with great fortune? And how do we maintain a democratic society when economic power is so unevenly distributed? The families who quietly ruled America during the Gilded Age provide no easy answers to these questions, but they offer lessons about both the possibilities and the dangers of unconstrained capitalism. They show us what humans are capable of achieving when freed from traditional constraints, but also what they are capable of when freed from accountability. Their story is a reminder that in America, wealth has always been more than just money. It is power, influence, and the ability to shape the world according to your vision, for better and for worse. If you found this exploration of American history fascinating, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We explore the people, events, and forces that shaped our modern world, bringing you well-researched stories that go beyond the surface to reveal the complex truths underneath. Join us as we continue to uncover the hidden histories that explain how we got here and where we might be heading.